Hello everyone, my name's Kate and today I decided to make an undead hand dice holder out of polymer clay. I hope you liked the video. Let's cut the nonsense and get straight to sculpting. As I do for a number of my sculptures, I start off with a flat tinfoil base. I kind of bend it round, peeling the edges over into this kind of round oval sort of shape. I do make it bigger and then flatten it out so that it's not too bulky and there isn't as many air pockets in between the wraps of the foil. I smack the clay with my rolling pin to make sure that it's nice and soft so that when I roll it out to the right thickness it doesn't damage my hands along the way. Another reason why I smack it is that sometimes when you roll it out, the clay itself can start to break apart. Then, as the foil is quite flat and has no sort of definition, I use my clay glue so that the clay adheres a bit better. And then using my paintbrush, which I have dedicated to the clay glue as it has been completely ruined by now, I spread it all about. Then I place it on top of the clay and cut around it, as well as folding over the edges to make sure that it sticks to the foil properly in between adding the two layers on the back and front. And then I pretty much just repeat that process for the other side as well. Now I start to do this thing where I cut only about skin deep so that it doesn't cut the foil. This weird sort of flat shape. And then I cut out these rings where the arms are actually going to be. Now I do make this area in the middle much smaller later on. The only reason it's big now is because my first idea for this sculpture was for it to actually be a dice tower, not a dice holder. But it doesn't really go well when you don't have walls, so I decided to scrap that a little bit into making this one. But as you can see, that tinfoil that I did cut out, I kind of bended it into these weird lumpy shapes to act as dirt mounds for where the surrounding area of the hands are going to be. And then of course layer it up with some more clay too. Then using this thick wire that I have, I cut a long strip of it out. This is going to be the forearm of the longest arm that I make. I wrap it in foil, making sure that kind of the base of it is a lot thicker than where the wrist is going to be, to kind of match the definition of what an arm would actually look like. I then wrap it in clay and make sure to blend all of the clay seams together. When blending seams of clay together, it is good to use a mix of silicone tools and your own fingers to make it smooth and to leave no cracks anywhere. And then I start to work on the first hand by wrapping a ball of foil onto this exposed end of the arm. Like I did with the arm, I wrap it in clay as well. And blend it out, as well as adding a bit of extra clay around it to bulk out the wrist area a bit more. Then I cut the wire to start making the fingers. I bend them a little bit to kind of follow the natural way that a thumb would move, and then I stick it to it, rolling out some clay, cutting it down the middle so that I can surround the wire in the clay. It's kind of how I put clay around the wire. Now at this point, I'm only trying just to put down the form for each of the fingers, not trying to define them at all. I do a little bit. It's a bit useless since either way, I'm going to change the form later, which is why you shouldn't exactly go straight into detailing. You'll see that little hand pose I did just there? That proves my point that using your own body, your own hands, feet, legs, arms, whatever, is your best reference point for whatever you're making, if it's 2D art, 3D art, especially in sculpture though. You see me kind of trying to cut away some of the clay. I do this properly later on a much more intense sort of scale. I keep going along making the fingers. The pinky is a little bit smaller than the rest of them and hangs off the edge a bit more. Honestly, I hate doing hands. If you're an artist, whether that's 2D, 3D, whatever, you know how difficult hands are, and I decided to make a sculpture pretty much based around them, which isn't my brightest idea. I was doubting myself a lot at this point, but I kept going and I started working on the second largest hand, or longest arm, I mean. Again, just like I did with the other arm, I wrap it in foil, then wrap it in clay, cut off the excess clay, blend it in, and you get the gist. I then start working on the hand again. Out of all 3 hands, from all the different arms, this one I like the least. I don't know why, I just don't think I like the pose as much, and the hands come out a little bit spindly. Just look at how I make the thumb, it looks really strange right now. It does get better, obviously, I don't leave it like that, but it's difficult. You'll see me going back a lot in with my silicone tools on the fingers mostly, instead of my fingers on the fingers. That's weird. But that's because the fingers, like usual, they're smaller. When an area is smaller, I tend to use silicone tools more. If an area is bigger, wider, I use my fingers. Then I make the third arm. You see just how tiny this one is? It's really small. Smaller than, I think, the length of one of my fingers. So, you know, you see kind of the difference between the heights. And then, like I just said, I go in, I wrap it in foil, I wrap it in clay, I blend the clay, and then I make the hand on top. And then I make the fingers on top with the wires and the clay around the wires, and then I define them. I'm going insane. On the smallest of fingers and thumbs, I use my pliers instead of my fingers to bend them. And then I start pulling this pose a lot. Again, like I said, it's easy. I don't need to pull up a reference, I can just use my hands, and they're right there, they're right in front of me. And I can change them. Hands are the best reference. I mean, your hands are the best reference. But like I was saying, I just make the base, make sure that there's enough clay covering all of the little gaps, and I do leave the middle area flat. Even later on, I don't texture it at all, because that's where the dice are going to sit later on. Now that I have the proportions and form of each of the hands down, I start actually carving out the form. The proper form. Now doing this, how I kind of figured out what I needed to do was I got my finger and I pinched between my joints. I pinched between them. It kind of pinches the skin so that you can see the joints, where they are, and then I use that as a reference. Again, your hand is the best reference. Another thing I did was just kind of feel around my hands to see where the bones were, and then I cut the clay around where they would be. So there's kind of the lines of the bony lines that come down from your fingers that go through your hands. I sculpted around those. Your knuckles are very important too. Your wrist. Everything. Of course, I did also go online and use references. But I say my hand is the best reference, whatever. You can still use references online, of course. I used the hand of Vecna specifically for a lot of these, just to kind of see what other people interpreted it as, and then made my own thing based off of it. So of course they're not Vecna's hand, but you know what I mean. One half issue that I had was the foil underneath getting in the way, as well as the wire underneath the fingers kind of getting in the way of where I wanted to sculpt. If you run into this problem, you can just use your fingernail or something sharp or hard and kind of press the area of foil back in. That'll kind of help. Also, it just didn't really matter to me for this instance. It wasn't something that needed to be smooth, so having kind of the foil texture doesn't really affect too much. The wire, on the other hand, I just kind of covered that, spreading the clay down over the exposed bits, just as a very, very thin layer. I then use this sort of carving tool and scrape out sections of the arm and the hand. And then with this flat face tool, I press underneath. When you have sort of a damaged skin area, the skin works sort of as a flap, so there's the flesh underneath the skin and then the skin that kind of flaps over the top. So that's why I kind of dug in around the edges. Makes it look a bit more realistic. Which isn't always the best thing, because it's kind of gross, but you know. Then I just texture it a bit more. It was a bit silly of me to texture it before adding it onto the base, because in the process of me putting it onto the base, I'm going to smush some of these details, so it's just a big waste of time. But I didn't realise that in the moment. I add it to the base later on. It's not a huge deal. But pretty much to make these textures, I use this tool and kind of just rub it in. It makes it look a bit lumpy, a bit gross. And then I also use these little dots around the edges with the same tool. It kind of makes it look kind of like chicken skin. You know, when skin's been really irritated and it gets all lumpy and bumpy. That's what I was trying to go for. As well as some lines around it to make it kind of look all scratched up. I do join these two areas to make one long cut as well. There will be some big ones and some really small ones on the different arms as well. I do also keep in mind that there are bones under the skin, so I don't do this texture in all the areas. Sometimes I do kind of leave an area a bit more flat to just simulate the bone. And then I attach it to the base using an extra circle of foil too. To be able to secure it to the base, I added some extra clay around the bottom of it. This was what I meant by I shouldn't have done the texture beforehand, because now I'm going to have to blend it up into the arm and into those cracks that I had already made. But it's alright, it's not the end of the world. I could just go back and re-detail it again. I also used this other tool to make sure that there is a seam between the base and the arm, so that, you know, it doesn't look like it's coming in from the ground. And then I just go back up and start working on the fingers again. I make sure that there are these kind of long, spiky fingernails, as if it's been in the ground for a very long time and hasn't had time for a manicure. I then use this kind of spiky tool to rub in to where all the joints are to make these wrinkles along the hand. And I want it to be really wrinkly so that it looks like it's been in the ground for a super long time. I make sure to texture both the front and the back of the fingers. On the joints, I kind of use swirly lines, but on the bits between the joints, I just use regular scratches, layered lines, pretty much. Of course, I do also add scratches along the fingers too, like I've done with the hands and the arms, but keeping in mind the fact that, of course, they're very close to the bones, so I won't have to add that sort of fleshy detail that I've had before. I may have lost a bit of footage of me finishing the hand, but not to fear, because I have two others, not three others. To add this texture along the arms and the hands, I get this kind of hooked tool and rub it in, kind of making it a little swirly, but not as much as I would do if I was doing moss. If you've watched my other videos, you probably know how I do moss by now. I do it very often. And also along the bones, I do this scratchy detail too. This time I begin prepping the base before adding all of those kind of gashes into the arms, except I do still do it before attaching it to the base. Doesn't really matter though, because like I said, if I mess it up, it's my own fault. As this is the longest arm, I make sure that they're a lot bigger. A lot more kind of grimy gashes all across the arm, different shapes, different sizes. This one here is specifically my favourite one. So like I said before, get that kind of tool, hook it underneath the skin to flap it all upwards. I can only imagine what I'm saying is very repetitive, so I'll leave you alone for a little bit. Boo! Did I scare you? I hope not, because that would have been really mean. But what I just wanted to quickly say was, if you might have noticed it, but every once in a while I go in with that tool right there. It's a sharp tool, and what I actually do now is go in onto the clay and scratch it up, kind of mixing it all together so that it looks as if it's all been peeled and all a little bit mangled as well. And then I also go in with these little balls on top. These act as sort of like pus sacks-ish, kind of a bit disgusting, but it looks cool nevertheless. So I add those all over the 3 different arms. I tend to put them in groups of about 3 to 10, and then I texture them using a sharp tool. On the third one, I don't actually texture it before adding it to the base for once. Yippee! I did it! Woo! And then I go onto the fingernails and actually take the top of that finger off. It's the only one where I did that, and I think it kind of makes it a bit more unique as well. You'll then notice that I add an extra line of clay around the base of this one, even though I already have and I've already textured it. Notice how I do not blend it up into the actual arm. This is because this is going to act as the dirt surrounding the arm, so it's not actually blended in, and it kind of lifts up around it as it comes out of the ground. I use this little pig nose shape tool and roll it into the base. Usually I'd use that hook tool that I was talking about earlier, but I use that for moss and I'm not going to switch it up to use it for dirt. Not happening, because that would undermine my moss producing waffling. Anyways, like I said, I just scratch into the base. Kind of trying to do different kind of patterns, different shapes, you know. Not make it too boring. And that was the final of the sculpting, so I start painting it. This colour might look black at first, but you'll soon realise it's actually a very, 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 very dark purple. The reason I did this was to kind of simulate the look of a rotting hand. You know when something dies? Have you ever seen like a dead finger when it like goes black? That's kind of what I was trying to go for. But purple, not black, because I just said it's not black because it's purple. I paint that all over all 3 of the arms, kind of mostly avoiding the scratches and gashes that I had already made. I kind of go over the little bumps that I made too, but not really, because it, again, it's just kind of a waste of paint. Once that's dried, I go into the gashes with this kind of reddish, very dark sort of red colour. All the colours that I used to paint do dry a lot darker than what they are before they dry. I also overline the edges a little bit, just so that it kind of looks like there's blood all over it and it's a bit inflamed. I end up painting both the fingernails and the bones, kind of the same kind of yellowish, brownish, cream kind of colour. Then I dry brush on top of that, kind of a lighter white colour, just to add definition. You see it's pretty much the exact same colour, but I do change it later on. It does look a bit too obvious right now. It's a bit kind of out there, so I do change it and add more blood around it, so it doesn't stand out too much. Then the base is just brown. Getting into all of those little cracks that I'd made is quite hard, so I had to use a big paintbrush and kind of just jam it into the base. And then remember that dark purple colour earlier? Yeah, I add white, just a little bit, and a bit more purple, to lighten it up so that I can dry brush over all of that texture that I did earlier, so that all of the dark goes into the crevices and then the light goes on top, so it kind of looks like highlights and it looks really good and you can see the definition. It's really cool. It's called dry brushing. I probably already said that, but anyways, it makes it look less flat, pretty much, is what I'm trying to say. Brings out all of that texture that I did earlier. Then using this lighter red, which dries, again, like I said, a lot darker than this, it's nowhere near this bright. Put it in kind of the middle of those cracks where the flesh would be exposed the most. And like I said, I do overlap the bones a bit more, making them look so much more grimy. Then I go in with this disgusting green colour, as much as green is my favourite colour, in this kind of area. Doesn't look so great, because it's kind of grimy. I add it onto those little pus dots as well, and then of course around all the flesh so that it looks like it's been rotting and it's the mould. That is very disgusting. I then go in with a slightly lighter green just to make it stand out a bit more. I want the nail beds to look really inflamed, so I add kind of a reddish colour around them as well. I then dry brush a lighter colour over top of the brown base to make it look a bit more dirty. I then also add just a little bit of green to act sort of as little bits of grass, so it at least has a little bit of life in there. And I use this lovely gloss that I have, get in all of those grimy cracks and make it look very wet and disgusting. And that's the final detail that I have to do. And then the Undead hand dice holder is complete, with all the little dice in there as well. They fit perfectly. Just a quick FYI, sorry that this part is so shaky. I have very shaky hands, and recording this was very difficult. Bear with me please, I am so sorry. Thank you for sticking around so long, I really appreciate it, and I know I say this a lot, but I've come very far from when I first started doing this, and seeing how many subscribers I've gotten and how many people enjoy the stuff that I do is amazing. So thank you. I know this was a slightly longer video than usual, so if you did stick around for this long, then again, thank you. And if you'd like to, you can like the video as well, it'll help me, and also if you want to see more like this in the future, you can also subscribe. I hope you have an amazing day, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Bye!